All right, so welcome everybody to the ESS Fall Tech Exchange Series. Today we're going to have Randy Breeden, one of our principal architects, talking to us about the deep fakes and neural networks. Remember that we have a couple more coming up this fall. There'll be another one, part 2 of Randy's here next Friday. And then we're going to have one after that, a couple weeks after that, on our internship program. And then the final one will be later in December on 3D geospatial GIS. All right, so go ahead, Randy, let's go ahead and take it away and have fun.
Okay, the next one will be in 2 weeks, not next week.
Okay, so, great.
Thank you. This is called The Pathway to Deepfake, and it's an introduction into the history of neural networks or artificial intelligence. And the reason being is that deepfakes are becoming really problematic these days. And I'll go through an example, but what I need to do is to first of all build up what is behind a deepfake. How did we get there? What's really there? And the history behind it, because there's a lot of stuff that has happened over a very long period of time with artificial intelligence. The understanding of that, and this is going to be a very small slice of artificial intelligence, but the understanding of that is really critical to understanding of what a deep fake is, how to combat it, and actually the benefits of what deep fakes technology can do for us in the future going forward. So where we started with this series is Bill and I were talking about artificial intelligence. This year I've been entering a number of contests on artificial intelligence, and we were talking about, he was asking me about giving a presentation. I said, yeah, sure. You know, I hadn't actually ever attended any of these tech talks. And he asked, so I asked him, so, what are they? And he says, well, it's 4 to 5 days where we give technical presentations to people on various topics. I'm thinking, yeah, I can do 4 or 5 days of presentations, and we're doing an email exchange. I said, so are these 4 hours or 6-hour presentations? He comes back and says, no, 45 minutes. Well, if you've ever looked at any of the AI books, they're usually several inches thick. So I'm trying to think, okay, what can I talk about in 45 minutes on these things that makes sense? Not going too deep, not going too light, something that makes sense. And as I was building up a draft deck, getting close to about 80 slides, I came across a headline. The top one there, romance scammer uses deep fakes to impersonate a Navy admiral and bilk a widow out of nearly $300,000. Instantly, I had my topic. This came out a couple weeks ago. I was like, perfect topic. I can narrow down, go into that. A month or so earlier, there was a one where somebody used a deep fake voice to steal over $240,000 out of a company, imitating the CEO of the company. And these headlines are popping up more and more. In fact, one of the things we were testing out just before the presentation started was another deep fake that came across this morning of Mark Zuckerberg apologizing for Facebook, providing Russian misinformation. It was totally fake, but looking at it, you wouldn't know. And there's a long history of these starting to show up. Understanding what they can do and how we can protect ourselves really is understanding the technology underneath them. So this presentation for today, I'm going to cover artificial intelligence, the history of it, talk about neural networks, talk about machine learning, and talk about deep learning. going a very thin slice down that stack, but those stacks are what build up the ultimate area that we use for deep fakes, called generative adversarial networks, or GANs, which is what next session will be. That GAN is extremely powerful, both in a defensive, offensive capabilities. It can be used in cybersecurity. It can be used in medicine. It can be used in any number of ways. And understanding what it can do opens the doors for things that science fiction has yet to begin to explore. And in fact, what we will see is science fiction hasn't even touched what AI can do these days. So to start with, I'm used to talking to live audiences. So please, if you have any questions, raise your hand. Bill will let me know. At the end of the slides, I will pause. I encourage questions because I love them. They give me an opportunity to actually go into different areas and understand what everybody's really looking for. And, feel free in here. It also gives me a chance to rest in here. So start with, at this point, what are we talking about with artificial intelligence? Merriam-Webster, a branch of computer science dealing with simulation of intelligent behaviors in computers. This is what AI has really represented for decades. And when I say decades, we're talking early science fiction, 30s, 20s, as far back as you can remember. This is what artificial intelligence has really meant. And this is what everybody's been talking about. The early science fiction books, I, Robot, and so on. This is what they have been simulating, is it's human-like behavior that we've been dealing with. Being, if you go look at it, what's the definition of IA? They come up with something that's a little more geekish, but again, it goes along the same lines. What they focus on more is the tasks that IA can be partitioned along these days. But if you ever go into or ever talk to somebody who is actually working on IA and you say, hey, what is IA? Well, first thing they'll say is, well, it's magic. And you'll find this all over the place, actually. When you're talking to the people, or if you go to talk to the scientists and stuff, they say, well, it's really magic. And reality is, it is magic of sorts. It's the magic of mathematics. And if you really start digging into them and say, okay, give me this mathematics, give me this magic, I want to learn it and stuff, then they start espousing different things at you. They give you the they'll start throwing these formulas at you and say, well, you have to learn this, and this is what you have to do, and all of this, and you have to apply this to it. Well, we're not going to do that today. We're going to dig into this, but we're not. It'll take you forever to do that. And the reality is, nowadays, with all the libraries and everything that's available, you don't have to go down this path anymore. Thank goodness. So, what are the common AI tasks? What kinds of things can we have artificial intelligence do for us? Really breaks down to these 10 items. Classification. This is the one, if you look at some of the books, it's is it a dog or is it a cat? AIs can take a look at things, they can take a look at problems, and they can classify them for us. that turns out to be very useful because they can classify things in ways that we as humans actually will have a very hard time classifying. They can pick out things and identify correlations that we will miss. They can take a look at patterns that would take us months or years to identify. They can pick them out very quickly. They can do regression. Regression is the ability to take a look at the data and then figure out past and even future, what may happen, what has happened, what might happen in the future. One of the ways this is applied, which is kind of funny, but it actually is working, is stock picks. Where do I think my stock's going to go? And they can actually figure that with a pretty good amount of accuracy in many cases. Transcription, taking it from one language to another. Machine translation, being able to translate signals into something more readable, more understandable, and so on and so on. So there are these groups that AI technology is really handy at being able to provide at aiding us humans and providing very valuable support for us in there. Okay, so this next slide, eye chart, but this will give you an idea. This is a chart from Bloomberg Beta of the AI products that have shown up on the marketplace over the last few years. As you can see, it covers, and by the way, this isn't the full chart, this is just blown up so you can kind of see the words, but it covers almost every industry, it covers almost every data type, and it covers almost anything you could think of out there. There's an AI product for it, usually covering one of those AI tasks that I just provided for you. Okay. At this point, are there any questions? I need to take a break for a second here.
I guess the question I have, I don't have any questions yet from anybody listening.
Okay.
I'm curious, just I see that Amazon Alexa is on there.
Yes.
I'm curious how they use AI or machine learning for Alexa.
Okay.
For voice recognition, maybe?
That's one of the aspects. And actually, when I get into about 6 slides down, I'll go into that in more depth.
Okay.
Because that is one of the areas that when I started trimming out the slides out of the deck, that is one of the areas that I trimmed out of the deck in there, because I realizing that that's one of the things that people would be very interested in. So it's also a possibility for a future talk in here. So anyways, so now let's kind of talk about the history here that we're looking at on this thing, on AIs and in particularly neural networks. There are what I'm going to call 2 waves of this technology. So the first wave started in 1943. It's called, and it started with a concept called the electronic brain. It was brilliant. In the next slide, I will go into more detail of what this electronic brain was. That concept actually is the fundamental underpinnings of all of the neural network AI today that we have today. That concept they use to build up everything, build up the AI research, all of the technology. They all the way through the 60s, which they consider the golden age, all of the development and everything continued on with it. And then in the 1970s, they kind of hit what I coin as a neural winter. Instead of a nuclear winter, they kind of hit a neural winter where they had reached the limits of what they could do with the technology that they had for the neural brain. That they couldn't take it any further in there. So that was really the first wave of neural networks. And as you can see, it went for a very long time. So what was this electronic brain? The idea was, and it was based upon the human brain, is that you had a bunch of sensor inputs, such as you had optical sensors, you had audio sensors, you had tactical sensors, and these sensors would each take an input. Let's say in this case, I have a horse out here. I would take the optical input for the horse. I would provide weighted features of the horse or weighted inputs. So it would say, it has this characteristics of what I'm finding visually. And when I say characteristic or features, it's specific elements that I have identified as being that horse. For example, a tail, a mane, forelegs, whatever I identify in there. And, I would so on with my sound, hearing, tactical, my being able to touch it and stuff like that. That would all come in as input into these neural sensors or neural centers, or what we call hidden layers. The brain, this hidden layers, would then use this information, weigh out all of it, filter it out, and then provide an output to say, hey, it's a horse. Brilliant. And as I said, that went up into the 70s. This was fundamental for a lot of our automation, robotics, even to the end of a lot of the mapping that we use today in Google Maps and stuff like that was all developed using this type of technology. But it had its limitations. For one thing, when they started off, they were thinking, well, obviously, we humans, we have the ability, after we're born, we can take all this input in, we can use it to develop our understanding of the world around us. We should be able to do that with a computer. Problem they ran into was limitations on the technology itself. First of all, if you take a look at the human eye, for example, we can see a vast array of colors that can't even be reproduced yet with the technology. Same thing with hearing. Our range of hearing and the fine tuning of hearing within our ears goes far beyond what they can do in technology. They are able to do different ranges than we can, but the capabilities are not there even today. So one of the limitations they ran into was simply, how do we get all the sensory data and cover it? The second part they ran into was, once you get it into, even if you could get for example, an eye sensor, it took a significant amount of work to fine tune each of those little black circles up there to get it to say it's a horse at the end. and that was a manual operation. So to effectively be able to do more than a handful of things, handful being 2, 3 specific objects, could take months or years of training and tuning to make it work right. So it became very expensive. It was hard to reproduce. For some things like autopilots or robotics, where you could say go left, go right, those became practical because you could say, hey, if this sensor is hit and this one is not, then you could give it specific commands that you couldn't do in a digital computer or as easily and have it perform correctly. But it really had a lot of limitations on what they can do. And that's what happened in the 70s, is they really came up against these limitations of, you couldn't get enough bandwidth, enough horsepower. You couldn't, programming it was a nightmare. It took some really smart people to make it work. So you ended up, it just wasn't practical except for a handful of things for it to work. So that brings us to the second wave. The second wave of neural networks is about 1986. A team of scientists developed what was called backpropagation. Backpropagation was the keystone for the neural networks. It opened the door for what we call machine learning. It removed the roadblock on that entire being able, limitations of what neural networks could do. So now we had the ability to actually go beyond the manual programming of everything. 1995 came the support vector machines, SVMs. SVMs were another big stepping stone. So if you were to take each of these arrows here, you could take a look at the first one. It would be big. The second one would probably be another third bigger than the first one. And then in 2006, we have deep learning. Deep learning is massive. So it would be twice as big as the other two. All three of those have completely turned everything we've been doing upside down. And in many cases, everything you've touched today, from your smartphone to your microwave, has been impacted by those three technologies alone. So, okay, so let's start with backpropagation. We already talked about, I have my horse over here. I've got my input. I've trained all my hidden layers, and they've given me mouse. Oops, I haven't got my neural network trained yet. Now, I'm using the word trained here on purpose, because the process of teaching the neural networks what it is I want them to do with the input is called training. This is what backpropagation gave us. So now I say, I don't want you to do mouse. I want you to give me horse. And this is horse over here. So given that this is what I want you to give me with this input, we now use backpropagation, another one of those really ugly mathematical things. It takes that information, it ripples it back through all the hidden input layers, or the hidden layers, and trains them for horse. Now, the complexity of this is very, very high. Consider, before I was saying with the before back propagation, if I had 3 things that I was looking at on my input, such as a horse, a mouse, and a house, it would take a very long time for me to program those into the neural network. One of the reasons for those is that it's not as simple as today's programming, where I could say, okay, if it's a horse, then you do this. If it's a house, you do this. You have to combine all of those. So it's not if it's a horse or a house, if it's a horse, house, mouse, here's how I want you to weigh things out. And with back propagation, it has to do that as well. So it goes through and says, okay, let's just make some minor adjustments back here to see if we get the right results. In a couple slides here, I'll give you, actually next slide, I'll give you a better idea of that, but it's not as extreme as saying this is horse. It's let's make some adjustments to make it more towards a horse. And the computer keeps doing this many, many times with each of the different answers until it finally gets all of them right. So, example, I have my training data. So I'm going to train my AI for machine learning, and I'm going to train it. This is a bicycle, this is a boat, a car, and an airplane. And I may have in this, I may have 1.5 million pictures of each of these that I'm using to train it. Now, 1.5 million is not bad, to tell you the truth. That's a pretty good sample to work with, because it takes them a lot of data to get these things to understand. And what happens is I'll give it the first picture of the bicycle, and I'll tell it this is a bicycle. And it will go through and it will set all of its nodes and say, okay, I got a bicycle. Next one, it'll say this is a boat. It'll go through, set the nodes and say, adjust them to get a boat. And it'll keep going through those 100 million records, or 1.5 million records. And it will keep repeating them until it gets a vast majority of them right. When I say vast majority of them, you're usually looking for about 90% correct. That, you may think, well, I want 100%. The reason you don't want 100% is because you want it to be able to detect something that is different. For example, in the test data, my car below, I want it to be able to detect that car, which was not in my training data. If I went with 100%, it would not detect that car. Now, consider this a little bit. Because I am looking at a 90% training on the AI, that means also that the AI may not detect my car. That has considerations. You have to keep that in mind when you're looking at using the AI to detect what you're going to work with. In some cases, for example, I just came out of law enforcement arena. It is great for helping to detect patterns and helping to detect possibilities. but it may also miss things, and you have to be aware of that. Same thing, one of the projects I was just working on was working on aircraft maintenance and predictability of maintenance and maintenance issues. Great, it can identify maintenance issues before they happen. But there's that 10% where it may not detect it. That has to be taken into consideration and understood, because of the variability of what you're looking at. Again, this is a whole nother topic I could go all day on. There's a lot of different pieces here, a lot of very interesting stuff that you can to cover, without even getting into the technical stuff. Just things like bias and some of the stuff that comes up, come up recently, like AI being thrown out of the course because the AI was considered to be racially biased. Those types of things. Understanding what's underneath it is critical in those areas. There. Okay. Any questions on that?
Well, we do have one question, Randy.
Okay.
Is the AI data and the information limited to what it's introduced to? I'm thinking that's meaning, can it learn what other type of data is out there, or is it only the data that you give to the AI that it will learn from?
Well, the answer is yes and no. Let me get into deep learning, and you're going to find the answer is very much. It can learn a lot more than what's available, and in fact, that goes back to your Alexa question.
Okay.
So, and that part of it is actually getting in a couple slides down. Okay, so the next thing I had on the list was support vector machines. So support vector machines developed 1995 era. They were primarily developed for Hollywood props. I mean, you have to give them credit. They needed something in the Hollywood screens with all the flashing lights and everything that they could show in these AI films whenever they, went into these massive war games and everything that they can show. So introduce support vector machines. The CM5, for example, Randy Amble can probably laughing his tail off right now looking at this thing. But the CM5 was one of the earlier support vector machines, massive AI machine. It was used, it was one of our earlier AI machines that was dedicated for vector processing. Why vector processing? Most of the neural network processing boils down to you take it down to a matrix and you process it in matrix multiplications or set processing or vector processing. So you needed special processors built for that capability. Now, to give you an idea, I kind of threw this slide up here to give you an idea of what the capabilities changes have been over the last 25 years. On the right, 65 gigaflops, massive building, air conditioning, massive power hog, the whole bit. On the left, you have a USB stick that is 1,000 times more powerful, a very small fraction of the power required for it. This is where AI is going. I have 2 AI systems in my house right now that are more powerful than anything we had 10 years ago. And some of the AI systems that are being deployed within some of these federal organizations these days are hundreds of thousands more powerful times more powerful than what were even available 10 years ago. So this whole AI technology is growing faster than you can, than people can even believe, even I can believe. And in fact, one of the reasons I wanted to show the video earlier was the deepfake technology. What, 3-4 years ago required a pretty hefty computer to generate. That USB stick that's up there will generate a video now that will be very hard for someone to tell the difference between a real person and a AI generated person.
And I just looked up how much one of those neural sticks costs. $70.
Yep.
It's crazy.
And you can plug multiple of them into your computer and parallel process them.
So is that all that people out there need now to make the deep fakes? Is a couple of these neural sticks?
Yep.
All right.
Yeah. I mean, it's insane. What's capable now is totally incredible. Okay, so now we get into deep learning. How much more time do I have here, Bill?
You still have, we're scheduled till 3 o'clock, so, you still got a good 15, 20 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Not too bad.
Yeah, if we go a little over, that's fine.
Huh?
If
no,
we go a little, that's fine.
I think I'll be in there.
Okay.
So deep learning. We've talked about like the neural sticks and stuff like that. What really, part of what has really driven deep learning is the availability to commoditize array processors. The CM5, you can now get that processor in a stick, but you can also, for quite a while, you've been able to get that level of processing on your graphics card. You go get your NVIDIA, you get your AMD card, and it's the same thing. It has that level of processing, array processing, and that capabilities. All of the stuff that you needed for your AI is built into one card. You can throw multiple of those cards into your PC and have tremendous amount of power. And it's that power that's been leveraged to develop a lot of the deep learning capability, even before some of the bigger deep learning systems have been developed. NVIDIA, they have been working on game AIs as well as professional AIs. Pixar has been working with Sun. They've been working with several companies, mostly for the graphics capability, but a lot of what they did in their movies also started moving towards the AI capability, where they no longer had to develop frame by frame. They could develop general movements of their characters and make their characters more lifelike, realistic. So a lot of this technology is been developed heading that way. The other big driver for this has been data. Whereas machine learning, we're talking about megabytes, gigabytes, generally in the gigabyte arenas. With deep learning, you're talking about being able to look at terabytes or petabytes of data and analyzing that. And when you're talking that much data, again, even if you have an analyst sitting there who's siphoning through the data, it's hard for them to be able to put together the correlations needed to even understand the data. And I'll tell you that from experience. One of the things I had to do a couple of years ago is I had a multi-terabyte data set that I had to determine how to reconfigure it to be able to use it for purposes of analyzing it for other analysts to use. I ended up using, in the background, using AIs to help me determine how to best analyze it myself before I could determine how to let others analyze it. Because you're looking at this thing trying to figure out, I don't know how to make it match in there. So, hey, come on. Hello. Wake up. There we go. Okay. So when you're talking about deep learning, you're talking now with when we were talking about machine learning, we were talking about putting it into an algorithm or into a tree or something that was pretty distinguishable as to what the information was that we were going to work with and how to categorize it. Now with deep learning, when we put the data in there, we're actually putting it into those hidden layers themselves. So we're no longer are we building, we're not building a algorithm as they put it in the previous one. We're actually building the inferences between the different data. So, the question, does it only know about the data that you give it? The answer is not really, because in the deep learning environment, the training of it actually continues as it goes on. So it takes not only the training data, it takes the test data, it also takes the live data. So as it's going on, it's using all of that to learn with. So going to your Alexa example, okay, as she's beeping over here. When you say something, you hear all the time, Siri, all these things, they're news articles. Oh, they're listening to you all the time. The answer is yes, they are. They're not listening to your conversations, but they are listening to you, because what they need in order for them to understand what you're saying is they need to be able to train with your voice. So they will start with a pattern. When you first get them, they will say these words. Those words will be used to set a basic pattern that they're going to use to adjust everything with. From then on, if you call them up and say something, give them a command. If you are happy with the command, they say, okay, they'll recognize that, give it a check mark and said, yes, I did the right thing. If you are not happy with the command, say, no, that's not what I wanted, stop, or whatever else. They will then pay attention to that, say, okay, I did it wrong, just like I showed you back on, we talked about on the few slides earlier. And they will then come back and say, pay attention and listen to what you say next. And they will use that to determine what was wrong and retrain themselves. Now, they're doing this constantly. And this is the only way they can get better and improve themselves. This is part of that, terabyte, petabyte of data that they're constantly using. This is how they learn accents. This is how they improve themselves. This is how they are able to learn new phrases. For example, Amazon just released a whole new set of functionality on their devices. That is because they were able to listen and pick up new training capabilities over the last few years and embed those training capabilities into these connected layers that you see here. They're constantly learning. They're constantly picking it up. And part of what happens here is they also, you'll notice from time to time, all of a sudden, something that was working for months seems to stop working. It's like the system went brain dead. All of a sudden, you're going, you just did this yesterday. Why can't you do this today? In order to keep the systems from running dog slow, they have to do what's called pruning, where they start taking fringe information and trim it off in order to help keeping the systems moving and everything. It's something that's ongoing. It's something that's constantly improving, constantly going on. But it's also, it's a massive, it's a massive brain out there, folks, down there. So, a couple differences here between machine learning and deep learning, to distinguish the difference between them. So machine learning, you take a look at face recognition. Okay, so you're in the airport, you hear about face recognition all the time. And, the airport has this face recognition where they go in, they can detect faces. Okay, detecting a face is not necessarily knowing who that face belongs to. It takes a lot more data and a lot deeper learning to know who that face belongs to. That's face identification. So the processing is typically, they'll do the face recognition, extract that piece out of the picture, and then it goes to another system which looks for specific face identification. Different process, but it's the way they make it sound, it's like, oh my gosh, they're going to find me. No, that's not what happens. They're looking for specific people at that point, because it is a different process. Again, different topic, but it's there, and the way it works, I find very interesting. Yeah, machine learning. When you're deploying machine learning and working with it, you really have to understand the data enough to be able to tell the machine learning inference machine what to look for. When I talked about before on the horse, yeah, you got to tell about the mane, you got to tell about four legs, that's what you have to tell on the machine learning side, the features that it has to understand. On the deep learning side, it can figure that out itself. And in fact, on the machine learning side, it's limited to, depending on how complex they are, it may be 10, 20 features that you're working with. On the deep learning side, it can be 100 or more. And it can tell you in the deep learning, when it starts churning on those things, it can tell you which ones are important to look at and which ones are not. And there have been many cases documented where when they started pumping data through deep learning engines, where the deep learning engines came back and said, hey, this is important. And people who've been working with the data for years have said, no, we've ignored that for all these years. It can't be important. It turned out it was important on there. So, you know, we're still learning it. And it's a very fast growing area of technology. And it's also very important for the next phases we're going to be looking into. At this point, are there any questions?
Yes, we got one. If the machine's holding the program and gets corrupted, would that automatically corrupt the information in the AI?
Could you say that again?
So if the machine's holding the programming gets corrupted, it's maybe the virus is on your desktop or workstation, would that automatically or somehow flow into corrupting what the AI does when it's in operation?
That's I can't answer yes or no on that one. The reason being is it's a lot more complex than just saying if my data is corrupted, my AI is corrupted. If, for example, if I'm using a model that has been pre-developed out of a pre-developed library, that model isn't going to change because the virus changed my data. Now the results will be messed up, but the model's still the same. On the other hand, if I'm, you know, if the virus messed with my data and I'm using that data to program the AI, then yeah, potentially it you know, the AI is getting garbage in there, but you're looking at really how much are we talking about, and where is it we're talking about the data going in. In fact, that may be a good definition for the next slide. You know, when you're taking a look at all of this, this is the different types of neural networks that are out there. And, you know, some of these, for example, if you're taking that natural language processing, NLP, you know, if I'm giving it garbage, a garbage document, yeah, I'm going to get garbage output. But the translation is still the same. The AI is still the same. You know, so it doesn't affect the AI per se. You know, on the other hand, if I'm building a translation engine, yeah, it could mess it up, but I can always reprogram it at that stint. On the other hand, if it's something massive, you know, like on the order of, you know, 30 terabytes, if I've messed up 30 terabytes of data, I think I'm kind of hosed all the way around on there. So give you an idea, that box is what we've talked about today. You know, as you could see, when I originally started talking about, yeah, I could probably do 4 to 5 days. There's a lot to talk about.
Right. Yeah, I can see that.
I mean, there are a lot of pieces here, a lot of them very interesting. And in many cases, I don't have to go any deeper than what I just did to cover some of these things out here. You know, there are so many times actually during this presentation itself that I bit my tongue where I could have said, well, you know, and if we did it this way, there's a lot of stuff here. And, you know, I truly entertain questions offline. You guys are welcome to do so. There's the material out there is growing daily. It has now become available. Amazon has free accounts. Microsoft has free accounts. They're encouraging everybody to use their AI engines. I'll give you a hint. There's a reason they're encouraging everybody to use their AI engines, because that's the way they can make their AI engines more flexible. They can collect more data. They can actually expand them. They have to have the data. That's the way to get it. It's going to grow, and it takes the data to do it. Now,
well, certainly there can be we can do a whole mess more of these as you have time and want to do them. So this is a great beginning.
Truthfully, I would love to. You know what's going on. It's going to take me a few months.
Sure.
I would love to do it. This is one of the topics that's close to my heart, and for many reasons. I have been my first neural network was built 1980. God, what was it? Late 1980s. And it was built with these things called EEPROMs. I don't know if anybody knows what those are anymore, but that's where I started learning a lot of what the AIs were and what they didn't do. But there's a lot of stuff here, and I think it's fascinating watching this stuff, and I love it going.
So today, why don't we end with this question? How long do you think it's going to be before we get sci-fi type of AI? We're like the robots that can think for themselves.
Well, that becomes kind of a tricky question, because I think we are already there in many cases. It's scary to say, but if somebody wanted to build an AI type robot that was against humans, or wanted to attack style, I think much of the technology is already there.
We'll assume that humans are generally good and they won't build ones that attack us.
Okay.
Assumption.
But those are under real considerations now, because a lot of the technology is already there. A lot of the understanding is there. Part of why I went with the deep fakes is because when you start looking at, what is it, what's your real end goal on these things? If you're going to look at confusion, mass confusion, tearing down societies and stuff, deep fakes have already started doing that in ways that we haven't really considered. So I'll give you a bonus question for next show, or for next presentation, is what was the first deep fake? And I will give you a hint. It ran or caused mass confusion, and there were reported suicides and homicides because of it.
You're not talking about the first, the Orson Welles War of the Worlds.
Yes, I am.
I win.
So you looked at my LinkedIn site?
Nope, that's my own personal geeky sci-fi knowledge.
Okay. Well, but yes, you're correct. That was the first deep fake. And, you consider that was 1938. We're talking, if a media site chose to do the same thing today, it could have serious repercussions.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So, and we haven't seen anything like that, such as Pintos blowing up or anything since, but okay. So, last chest.
All right. Well, we don't have any more questions.
Okay. Well, I hope everybody's enjoyed this and has found it worthwhile.
I certainly have, and I'm looking forward to your next one.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Randy.
Okay.
All right. Everybody have a good day and take care.